it's good to see you after all
And
these
you.
years.
I can see it's bright sunshine outside.
It's very bright. Yes, there's a magnificent sunset.
Wow,
Um,
and a grandchild's pram. That's the
yes,
mark of a 21st century grandparent.
I've got a pram. I've got a high chair.
You've got a car seat?
Got a car seat. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're all prepared.
Absolutely. Are all your children in Israel, or
Yeah.
are the
No,
none in London?
No. I have nobody left in London except an aunt and some
Oh,
cousins.
okay.
Both my children live in Tel Aviv. I've got 4 grandchildren.
Lovely.
My oldest is in the army. It's a long time since we sang together.
It is.
I've still, you know, there's a VHS tape of that Sefer Torah consecration
No, I didn't know that. Have you got it?
somewhere,
Oh,
and I'm singing with you. I'm singing Nambog Su'usharim.
brilliant. Of course, we do that in the cantorials. Usually we do it with Henry Black.
Oh yeah, and a great friend of mine.
Yes.
I heard you do a concert when I was in England. I suppose about 2 or 3 years ago, perhaps.
That was in Ilford. I saw you in Ilford.
That's right. You did it with Gary.
Yes, Gary Newman.
Gary Newman, and one of your choristers was Judah Harstein,
That's right, who now's with you.
who's now with me.
Yes.
He and his wife live in Netanya.
Okay, so I'm going to let people in. We've got about half a dozen so far joining us, and I said that we'd start about 8:05, all being well. How long does the actual talk go on for? Is it about 3/4 of an hour or an hour?
About 3/4 of an hour.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be a few people that want to say some things to you afterwards, because I know you'll recognise some of them.
I'm absolutely sure.
Okay, let me admit there's about a dozen joining us now.
Hello, Nigel.
Hello, Elkan. How are you?
Fine, and you?
Yes, thanks. So you realise it's 50 years since we formed the Belmont Choir?
What is it? Whatever you sit down.
Gosh.
Good.
Last, yeah.
Going strong.
1971, that was.
Wow.
I
What
was.
time, Nigel?
I did my
Hi,
second
everyone.
stint in Belmont from. Hello, Melvin.
Hello, how are you?
Right. Andy, this gentleman I'm talking to is somebody I was in some pools with. Wave your hand, Melvin, so my partner knows who you are. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello there. How are you?
Hello, Julian. Julian Charles. How are you, young man? Oh, it's a frozen picture,
Oh, Julian?
I
Is it
think.
cold? Is it iceberg?
He's definitely frozen. He's definitely
It's
frozen.
going to be a talk, yeah.
Good evening, Elkan.
Good evening. The Branstons. How are you? How are you?
You. I think the last time we met, we went to a wedding together.
Whose wedding it was?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
took us all
right.
the
We
way-
did.
Gave us the lift.
Which has produced.
Somebody's going to talk, I can't remember who.
It has produced. I tell you what I was thinking about you recently, because I was talking about 19th century Jewry,
Yes, my
and I
head.
said and I spoke about Mrs. Moses and Herman Adler, and you won't forget the plum pudding.
That's right. Yes, that's right. I told you. It was a true story, actually. I heard it from my grandmother, who was the daughter of the recipient of that.
Marvelous story.
They weren't never in those days.
No, not at all.
Evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi, Aubrey.
All right.
Hi, Aubrey. Nice to see
Good
you.
evening. Good evening.
Good evening, everyone, from mild and sunny Cambridge today.
You're lucky.
No hailstones. That makes a change.
No hailstones, no snow, no.
Wonderful.
No.
It was almost. It was about 36 today, so that's what pushing.
36.
I'm not even sure we'll get to 36 in the entire year. Here.
We were
Well, if
talking.
you-
We were talking to somebody in America the other day, and my partner's daughter, and we said it's 26 here centigrade. She said, yeah, it's 26 here Fahrenheit.
Wow.
David, I'm doing my best to transfer. I've just been watching South Hampstead School, had David Baddiel giving a talk, a webinar, all about his book about Jews Don't Count. You must have heard about his book.
I think so.
And he was being questioned by the girls from South Hampstead about his book Jews Don't Count. But of course, there are an awful lot of Jewish girls at South Hampstead.
Large
There are a lot of Jewish ones there as well, I think.
What?
Yeah. Southampton.
Elkan, I should say that John Fox also went to St Paul's a little before me.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely right.
When were you there, John?
Oh God, I don't know. I'm talking. It's about 150 years ago. I can't remember. Sometime just after the war, I think.
Oh wow!
And I'm not talking about
the Boer War.
The War of the Spanish Succession.
Yeah, that's right.
The War of Jenkins' Ear.
I remember Agincourt quite clearly. We all had a half holiday when we beat the French. The Bernard de Montmorency came along and gave us we all got a half holiday. We did. Melvin, do you remember Monty coming along to the school giving a talk?
Yes, I told you about that, didn't I?
Yes,
the annual inspection, and it was such a hot day.
Were you? Hold on, John. Were you
the
there?
tarmac melted.
Were you there when Monty did the annual inspection?
Yes.
Well, I was certainly there when he came along to give us a talk, and I can certainly remember some of the important part. The most important part of his talk was when I was captain of the first 15, we didn't lose a match, and I'll tell you why. Because I had a plan, just like the plan I had at El Alamein.
Melvin and I would have been inspected in 1959.
19 when?
1959 for the 450th.
I think I was before 1959.
Well, I might.
I got married in 1959. So.
I remember Monty on television being interviewed about El Alamein when I was about 10, but I'm a bit younger than you. And he said, and I only lost 10,000 men. I remember that phrase.
Well, that might have been very good, of course.
It was very good because the Germans lost 100,000, or the Italians.
I can't remember how many men. I know that he wouldn't attack Rommel until he got a very, very large excess of equipment and men.
And
he was never going to lose. He just waited until he got overwhelming odds and then had to go against Rommel.
Okay, gentlemen, I think we'll start now. So I'm going to mute everybody, and then I will unmute you, Elkan, to run the affairs. Let me so I've muted everybody. Elkan, I'm just going to unmute you. Well, I'm asking you to unmute. You just need to unmute yourself, Elkan. That's
right.
it. Lovely. Okay, so we're ready. We're ready for the talk.
David, you're recording because I can't unless you give me permission, but it's fine.
I've given you permissions. You can record if you want to, but I'm doing it anyway, and I can always send it to you later.
No, that's no problem. It's much better that way.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, hold on, let me do this. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to share that. Go to there. Go to my pointer. Right. I'm going to take you on a whistle-top tour of a lot of Anglo Jewry. Some of it you'll know, some of the communities you may not know, and some of the facts may be completely new to you. I'm going to start with this. This is obviously a mezuzah. It's actually on my door in Netanya now. It was given to me by the Jewish community in Cornwall, with whom I had and continue to have a very close relationship. I was from 2004 to 2010 the Minister for Small Communities. And Cornwall is one of the very few provincial communities that's actually growing. This is a mezuzah that they had made, as it's obviously got the shin on it, but down here you will see there are the arms of Cornwall, because there was a theory that when King Solomon built the first temple and he made pillars of bronze, bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. You can make it with arsenic, but it tends to be expensive in operatives. So the copper, obviously, he got from Timna. Where was he going to get the tin? The theory was that the only two places that had big tin mines in those days were Afghanistan and Cornwall. And the theory used to be that he must have got it from Cornwall because the Phoenicians would have sailed their boats through the Mediterranean and up to Cornwall and picked up the tin there. And it's inconceivable that Solomon gave these Phoenicians money and told them to go and spend it for him without him sending some of his own people there. And that was the theory until a couple of years ago when they found these tin ingots. This is Cornish tin, and they were found about a kilometer offshore, or less perhaps, offshore from Haifa in some shipwrecks. So clearly there was connection between Jews, or certainly Hebrews, people who lived in the time of the first temple, with Cornwall. But the first Jews we know about came to England where they may have come with the Romans. There are some coins from the Second Temple period that have been found in excavations in England. One was found as far north as Argyll. There is a tombstone in a military cemetery in Scotland, a Roman military cemetery, with the name Salmanes, Phil Salmanes, which could be Shlomo ben Shlomo, and it's got certain palm trees and stuff on the decoration on the tombstone, which is particularly Jewish. But the first Jews that we really know about came over with William the Conqueror. And what I'm going to show you now is a star. It's a Hebrew document, and it actually conveys the land that I used to live in. It conveys the manor of Little Stanmere, which roughly starts from Elstree Crossroads, goes round the back of the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital, where there is still a ditch and hedge that marks the medieval boundary, goes down Dennis Lane and Marsh Lane, Honeypot Lane, to roughly where Queensbury Underground Station is, then moves due east, hits the A5, the Edgware Road, and comes all the way back up Stonegrove and up to the Elstree Crossroads again. This was bought by a man called Sir Stephen of Chendwit in about 1260 or 1270, and he did it with the aid of a loan from a Jewish moneylender called Chaim of Lincoln, whose signature we'll see in a minute. And he foreclosed. Chaim foreclosed on the loan, And in those days, it was something called a gauge. He owned the security, but he couldn't own it as a Jew, so he sold it to a rascally Catholic priest called Sir Adam of Stratton. And Adam of Stratton was, although he was a Catholic, he indulged in usury. He had a fairly big business in black magic, and he had a nice sideline in homicide. In the end, in about 1290 or 1292, he murdered somebody, and the king was a bit fed up with this, so he had him arrested. And on his person at the time was this document, which then went into the Public Records Office. If we look at it closely, this is the beginning of it. Ani hachotem mata, I the undersigned, Modeh Bahoda Agamura, admit with full force and effect. This is the wording that you get in a conveyance in Tel Aviv to the stay. Shepashati, that I have sold, and then this bit says to Sir Adam Hassar Adam Mistratuna. And here's what we call the parcels. This is what he's selling. Hamalon. Sadly, this does not mean the hotel. I was looking for a medieval Stanmore Hilton, but it doesn't exist. Hamalon means the manor. Mistanmira Hakatana of Little Stanmere, Befelech in the county, Midelshitza of Middlesex. And at the very end of the document, which has been written out by some clerk, it says, V'zot chatamti, and this I have sealed, Chaim de Nicol, Chaim of Lincoln, for some reason that I don't quite understand. In medieval Hebrew, the Lamed and the Nun of Lincoln were interchanged. And this is Lincoln Synagogue. If these two buildings still stand, I took this picture. If you're looking at medieval Lincoln, you have to assume that these two windows and the door don't exist, and that all these windows don't exist. All you've got is this massive doorway, and that these two houses are one side of a square, a hollow square, and that this is the only entrance in. In other words, this is a stone building built for defense. But these rooms, these are very interesting. This is the same room, those four windows, because it's the shul of the medieval community of Lincoln. And here in the eastern wall is an Aron Kodesh. The doors have been put on by the congregation of Lincoln. There's a liberal synagogue service that meets there about once a month, and they put these rather ghastly doors on, but that's the ark. It's actually big enough to hold 3 Sifrei Torah. When I went there, the lady archaeologist who showed me around said she didn't understand these windows. If you're standing with your back to the ark, this is what you would see. There are these two windows, and she said, I don't understand because the splays are different. These sides come out at right angles to the glass, and these are wide, obtuse angles. She said, I don't understand that. I said, yeah, I understand that. I'm sure many of you here have been to the Altneu Shul in Prague, and you will remember that the ladies' gallery sits behind is basically a corridor behind a thick stone wall with slits for the ladies to look through. This window actually still lets into an indoor room. This lets into the garden, but in medieval times, without any doubt, there would have been a room behind there. And what you are looking at is the ladies' gallery of the medieval synagogue of Lincoln. Now we know this is a very peculiar thing. This is on a tax roll in Norwich. There was a very big Jewish community in Norwich. It may possibly have been the largest provincial community. And amazingly, we actually have some poetry that a man called Mayor of Norwich wrote, and he signed it by putting his name at the beginning of verses. It's something maybe we'll deal with on another occasion. But here you have a depiction of a whole lot of Norwich Jews. This man is Isaac Phil Jernett, And he's actually not one-faced or two-faced, but actually, if you look at him, he's actually three-faced. And here is Moshe or Mocha, who was a moneylender, and he's wearing the pilum, the hat with a point. It has been suggested in an article I read yesterday that because Jews had to wear this hat, this may have been the origin of the kippah. It's not impossible. These are some devils attacking him. Here are some other Jews with scales. Here is Moshe's wife, Abigail, who is dressed absolutely in the height of fashion. And here are some more. Here's a Jew possibly blowing a shofar. And here are some more devils coming for the Jews. And nobody quite understands what these are. If this is actually of interest generally in English history, because it's the earliest English caricature that exists. And Jernit, incidentally, his house still exists in Norwich. But now I'm going to move from 1290 to 1655. In 1290, Edward I expelled the Jews. England was the first country to expel Jews in medieval Europe. It was also, incidentally, the first country to have the blood libel in 1144, the idea that Jews had to kill a Christian child for ritual purposes before Pesach. And the theory used to be that there were no Jews in England for 350 years. We know that that's not true. There were always Jews in England, in small numbers, overtly or covertly. King Henry IV wanted a Jewish doctor from Bologna in Italy, and the man said that he would only come if the king would give him passes for 10 other adult male Jews to come with him because he needed a minion. We know that when the Jews were expelled from Spain, although a large number of them went to Holland, there were Jews who came to England. There was a Jewish community in Bristol. There was a significant Jewish community in London. Somebody who visited them in 1546 reports that their favorite food is cold fried fish. Some of them were musicians for King Henry VIII. One of them signs himself in as Francis Calim, and then a couple of years later changes. Calim just means an instrument, and then he changes his signature a couple of years later, and he signs himself as Francis Kinnor because the Kinnor was the violin that he played. But then you get Manasseh ben Israel, and this picture is by his friend and neighbor Rembrandt, so we can assume it's a pretty accurate picture. He was a very interesting character, born in Madeira. He may have been baptized as a child. His parents came to Amsterdam, came out of the closet, as it were, as Jews, and his father took the name Joseph. So he named his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh ben Israel was a very clever man. He knew about 5 or 6 languages. He corresponded with major scholars, Jewish and non-Jewish, all over Europe. And Oliver Cromwell, during the Commonwealth after Charles I, began to think that Manasseh ben Israel was the leading Jew in Europe. He wasn't, but he certainly wasn't going to tell Cromwell that. And Cromwell wanted the Jews to come to England, not because of any particular philo-Semitism, but because at the time there were a lot of Jews in Holland, and they understood Spanish, and a lot of the world's wealth at the time was in the West Indies, and the Dutch were doing very well out of having their Jewish settlement, and Cromwell wanted some of that for England as well. So he starts talking to Manasseh ben Israel, and in the end, in the autumn of 1655, Manasseh comes to England, and the day after Simchat Torah, he goes to see Cromwell, carrying with him this book, the humble addresses of Manasseh ben Israel. You see, he describes himself as a divine and a doctor of physic. And he goes to see Cromwell, who is sitting in state in the throne room, in the banqueting house in Whitehall. You can still go there and visit it. And it's very beautiful. And on the ceiling of that room is this magnificent painted ceiling by Rubens, which was commissioned by Charles I. The subject is the judgment of Solomon between the two women who both claimed for the ownership of one baby. And he instructed the painter that Solomon was to be a portrait of his father, King James I. There was a lot of opposition to the Jews coming back. It was really a sort of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The City of London was very concerned that the Jews might be economically very successful and more successful than they were. So Cromwell called a conference in Whitehall in December 1655, and the first question that he put were to the two leading judges of the realm, and he said, what is the law that stops Jews settling in this country? And the answer amazingly came, there is no law. When the Jews were expelled in 1290, it was done by something called an Act of the Royal Prerogative, and it only applied to the Jews who were in England in 1290. There is no law stopping the Jews coming back. The Whitehall, that day, the diarist John Evelyn wrote in his diary, now were the Jews admitted. There were 4 more sessions of the Whitehall Conference, and what was clearly happening was that if Jews were going to be admitted, then they were going to be admitted on very strict economic terms. They could only live in certain areas, they could only pursue certain trades, they would have certain taxes. And this would undo the good that Cromwell hoped from Jewish settlement. So he went down to the Whitehall Conference one evening, made a magnificent speech and dissolved them, said, it is clear, no good is going to come from your deliberations. We thank you for your prayers. Good night. And nothing happened because everything is in limbo. Cromwell was very cute. He was just waiting to see what would happen. In March 1656, England was at war with Spain. And there was a Marano Jew in London who was pretending to be a Spanish Catholic, called Antonio Rodrigo Robles. And he had 2 ships. He was a dealer in gold and precious stones. He had 2 ships lying at anchor in the Pool of London, worth a great deal of money, and the state seized them as enemy property. And this put huge panic into the Marano community, because if that could happen to Robles, it could happen to any of them. They were all pretending to be Spanish Catholics. So Robles applies for the ships to be returned to him on the basis that he is not a Spanish Catholic, but a Portuguese of the Hebrew nation. And he puts all sorts of interesting affidavits in, including specifying how members of his family had been prosecuted by the Spanish Inquisition. And in those days, that was a real plus point in Protestant England. And then they also said, let's put a petition to Cromwell to be allowed to hold services and to buy a burial ground. And 6 members of the committee signed the application. They were not getting on well with Manasseh ben Israel. Jews normally in history, and to this day as well, like to keep a very low profile. And who told this Dutch rabbi to come over and start prancing up and down and hobnobbing with all the great and the good and giving us a high profile? We don't want it. But as they were about to submit this petition to Cromwell, somebody must have said to them, you know, Manasseh ben Israel knows Cromwell very well. You should get his signature on it. So they must have come to him and asked him to sign, expecting him to sign at the bottom. But Manasseh wasn't going to put his signature below these oaths. So he squeezed it in here, right at the top. And the net result was that Robles got his ships back, that the Jews were allowed to buy, to have a synagogue to begin with in a place called Church Lane, and they formed a congregation. In 1701, it was a Spanish and Portuguese congregation. 1701, they built the magnificent Bevis Marks synagogue, which I assume you've all been in. It wouldn't surprise me if you've even sung there. That's Bevis Marks. But if you're going to Bevis Marks, go to this corner here, right-hand back corner. The Sephardim were very parsimonious, and they kept the benches from the 1656 shul and put them there, and go and sit on them, because they are unbelievably uncomfortable, because our ancestors had they were small men and they had tiny bottoms. The Ashkenazim developed by 1690. They formed a synagogue for Ashkenazi Jews, which they called from the beginning the Beit HaKnesset HaGadol, the Great Synagogue of London. And it went through various buildings, and this is the 1791 building. This is an interesting engraving done in 1809 of the synagogue, and I want you to look at this molding up here, because we'll see it again later in rather tragic circumstances. But shuls developed because of fights and breakaways. The first breakaway came in 1805 when a man called Moses Hamburger queried something that the rabbi had done. One of the great risks of being a Rav or a minister is you will always find a member of the congregation who thinks he knows better than you do. And Mordechai Hamburger questioned something that Rabbi Ehrenhardt had done, and for various reasons he was excommunicated, partly because of what he'd done, and partly because the warden of the synagogue, a man called Rebbe Bedel of London, hated Mordechai Hamburger because they had both been courting the same lady, and she'd married Hamburger and not him. So in the end, and then came Sukkot, and the Ashkenazim didn't have any etrogim because they had ordered theirs from Tangier, and the winds were contrary and the ships couldn't sail. The Sephardim had got theirs overland from Italy, so they sent the Ashkenazim one etrog to be passed around the shul. And when it got to Mordechai Hamburger, they said, no, you can't have it, you're excommunicated. So he got very upset, and being quite a wealthy man, he formed a shul in his own back garden in Fenchurch Street. And eventually he built the Hambro Synagogue. This is the only known photograph of the shul before it was demolished in 1893. And it's really quite interesting because, look, this is the front row of seats, and there's a bookrest here. But you can't use that bookrest unless you're standing. It's impossible to use it when you're sitting. But it was quite a wealthy community. Because they have in the Jewish Museum, they have a Sefer Torah mantle, beautiful thing, with a picture of an ark embroidered on it. But the trouble is the embroidery has been done in wire and not in thread. And it is so heavy that it takes two men to lift it. I don't see how it was ever used. There's a beautiful Chanukiah in the Jewish Museum with some very nice barley sugar brass work on it. And there's a really lovely lectern carved into all sorts of detail, which is currently in the New West End Synagogue. That was the first breakaway. There's the Hambro mantle. I didn't think I had it here. And you see, look at the detail on that. Now that's all wire. That's their Chanukiah, and this is the lectern at the New West End. Look at it. I mean, look at this carving. This is a congregation that's got a lot of money to own something like this. The second breakaway was the new synagogue in Leadenhall Street. They broke away in 1761 because they complained they weren't being called up often enough. And which is one of the great things about Georgian synagogue history, is that the people and dates are different, but the rows are instantly recognizable. And this is, they bought a disused livery hall from the worshipful company of tilers and bricklayers, who nonetheless kept their wine cellar down below, which led to the rhyme, the spirits above are spirits divine, but the spirits below are spirits of wine. And they occupied this building from 1761 until they built their magnificent new synagogue at Great St. Helens in 1837. This is a close-up of that. If incidentally, if that ark looks familiar to you, it's because when they moved the new synagogue to Egerton Road in 1915, they copied the design. But this is a close-up of that engraving. Look, it's Sukkot. He's got really savage-looking lulav there. He's carrying something which may only have one roller. So, pardon me, it may be a scroll of Ecclesiastes, of Kohelet, that we read on Sukkot. And this man is carrying the Sefer Torah, and you'll see that a lot of people are wearing their talesim, like sort of off-the-shoulder shawls. But we actually know what happened to the 1751 furniture. This is Cheltenham Synagogue, 1839. It's a community that I still visit with Andy quite frequently. This synagogue is beautiful. The shul still exists. The community still exists. And most of the lighting comes from this big clear lantern up in the roof, because it's built, as it were, with no outside windows. There are some windows, but they are very modern. Those two windows at the end were put in the 20th century. And here, if you're standing here to take the services, as I've had the privilege of doing very often, you get the light coming in from the top. But the furniture is not 1839. This is the original furniture from the new synagogue in Leadenhall Street. Because when they moved into Great St. Helens, Cheltenham was building the shul, and they gave them the furniture. And this is, you can see here, these are the original benches. The cushions are modern, but the benches are backed with rattan. It's the most beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful place to daven.
Elkan, we've been there. We did a concert in Cheltenham.
You have been there, because when I gave this talk to David Rome, he actually played a clip of the choir singing.
Absolutely. We've got it on I think we've got it on YouTube. It's lovely.
I'd forgotten that. So you know that shul.
It's a lovely shul.
Really lovely shul with very historic furniture in it. And this you may have noticed when you were there. This is the prayer for the royal family. It's painted onto black painted canvas, and it has Queen Victoria on it. But when they restored it some years ago, behind Queen Victoria was George IV, and behind him George III, and behind him George II. George II came to the throne in 1727, but on the frame there is stamped the name Cole and Kings, manufacturers, and we know they went out of business in 1730. So this must have been made between 1727 and 1730, and it has to be the oldest Ashkenazi synagogue asset anywhere in the UK. This is Plymouth Shul. Since we're dealing with small communities, we'll go down to the West Country. This is Plymouth, opened in 1762. I did the 250th anniversary service there with Jonathan Sachs. This is the Ark. It's a sort of, it probably came from Holland or North Germany as a sort of Georgian flat pack. But this is the Bimmer. This is the original furniture of the shul, and it was built by craftsmen from the naval dockyards. They know that because some of the joints in this wood are the sort of joints that were used in the building of ships. You can imagine this rail going round one of Nelson's ships at the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is the prayer for the royal family. It's a significantly different text because Plymouth is a military town. So you've got this wonderful sentence. O Lord, King of kings, of thy goodness we beseech thee to raise and remount the planet and fortune of his said majesty's arms, that his enemies may fall under his feet, and we beseech thee to prolong his days in his kingdom. Amen. We're involved with the Navy. Actually, a lot of the Jews in Plymouth were involved in supplying the Royal Navy. There was one company called Goldberg, which supplied uniforms to the sailors and had its main shop in Devonport, with branches in Portsmouth, Chatham, Gibraltar, and Malta. And on the Hoe, there's the cemetery. In 1744, somebody died and they had to bury him. So they asked a lady called Sarah Scherenbeek, who was a member of the shul, or she was Jewish because the shul didn't exist at the time, could they bury him in her garden? And she said yes. And this is now beautifully maintained by the caretaker of the shul, who has produced a very interesting audio guide, which you can find if you log into Plymouth Hebrew Congregation. And 40 miles to the northeast is Exeter. Exeter Shul is 2 years younger than Plymouth. It has the same verse over the ark, but certain of the letters are highlighted, certain different letters that shows 1764. It's a magnificent looking ark, marble, etc., which is all nonsense. The whole thing is made of wood, and all the marbling and the gold, etc., is just paint. But I think it's mainly Georgian paint, and they think there are about 40 different colors of paint that were used in producing it. And this was a wedding that I did in the shul in 2005, I think. But if there's a picture from the gallery, what's really interesting is the bimah. It is the only, it's not square and it's not rectangular, it's egg-shaped. Very unusual. It's a lovely shul. It's also one of the communities that Andy and I go to quite often when we're in England. If you go further west, you'll come to Penzance. Penzance had a shul which existed until about from about 1740 or 1750. It existed until about 1890 odd. But the cemetery is maintained. There's a small by the Jewish community of Cornwall. It's got a beautiful stone for the rabbi, who was Rabbi Barna Abraham Simmons. He fought like hell with his community, and his community kept on writing to the chief rabbi to complain about him. But when he died, they gave him the most beautiful mitzvah. And that's a picture of him, and that's a picture of his wife. Tragically, they had a little girl of 8 who died in a cholera epidemic, and her tombstone notes that she died on Shabbat and was buried on Shabbat. The reason is that it says in Hebrew, because of the plague, because they had to bury bodies very quickly because of cholera. And the other problem was that cholera victims were generally seized and buried in mass graves. So they wanted to bury her in the cemetery. And this is another picture in Penzance, in the Penzance Art Gallery. Opie was an artist who became the court painter for George III. Picture of an old Jew. I really like this because he's actually got the tefillin on. Very, very accurate, very beautiful, beautiful picture. Falmouth, as you go slightly back in Cornwall, Falmouth had a Jewish community from about 1740 or 1750, when a group of Jews came from Hamburg as a group, meaning to come and settle as a group. And they were led by a man called Moses Cohen, I think, Alexander, who's known in history as Zenda, which is a diminutive of Alexander, Zenda Falmouth. And this was the 1808 synagogue. It's now a private house, but it was built slightly up above the harbour. That's the view, because the big Jewish business was ship's chandlery, supplying ships. And if you could, if it was that high, so somebody could, above the harbour, somebody could nip out from time to time during davening to see what was happening, so they would know that if there were ships that were making into the harbour, then as soon as Shabbos was out, or possibly even sooner, they'd have to go down the hill and do the business. Falmouth is, of course, the first large natural harbour that you come to when you come up from the Bay of Biscay, and one part of Falmouth Harbour, called Carrick Roads, is still very much in use because it's very sheltered and very deep. And during the winter, you get some quite large liners that are laid up there. Brighton Brighton had a community from quite early on, but the first shul in Brighton was designed by an architect called David McCatter, who was actually Moses Montefiore's nephew. And he built this synagogue, Jews Synagogue, AM 5598, that's 1838. It's now a block of flats, but when it was restored, the people who did the restoration picked out that lettering again, so you can actually see it. There's David McCatter's name. He was also very famous as one of the early railway architects. Designed some of the viaducts on the London to Brighton Railway, and he designed Brighton Station, which is still in use today. This is another building in Brighton. It's really interesting. It's now the Bombay Bar, but it started life as the tomb of the Sassoon family, wealthy Anglo-Indian Jews, and they buried everybody here until about the 1930s. They moved the bodies to a Sephardi cemetery, I assume, in London, and it became the Bombay Bar. And this is another thing in Hove. This is Brunswick Terrace, but what I want you to look at is this little thing here, because that is actually a small private synagogue. A man called Philip Salomons, who was quite an old bachelor, suddenly married a girl from the Montefiore family, an 18-year-old, and they settled down here and had a happy family, and he wanted a shul on his premises. So he built this synagogue on the top floor. That's inside that little area that's headed with the dome that you've seen. But actually, I don't believe that was the whole shul, because you can't get too many people there. I think that must have been where they put the Aron Kodesh, because there's a room where the photographer was standing, where people, I think, would have sat during the services. And while you're in Kent, look at this. In 1847, the Jewish community of Canterbury had their original synagogue, which was built about 1750. They had it compulsorily purchased for the cutting edge in transport technology, Canterbury West Railway Station. So they built a shul here, and the latest fashionable architectural style at the time was Egyptian. It's when Cleopatra's Needle had come to England. So they built the shul in Egyptian style. Here are the gate pillars. This is what the shul itself looks like. It could have been an Egyptian temple. And this is what it looks like inside. This is what used to be the Aron Kodesh. It's not been a shul since about the mid-1930s. It now is the music room of the King's School, Canterbury. It is still known as the Old Synagogue. And from time to time, the school lent it to the Jewish community in Kent to have seminars there. I've run seminars there. And I once took Rabbi Sha'ari Yashuv Cohen, who was the chief rabbi of Haifa, to see this shul. And when we went in, he said, he said, it used to be a synagogue. We ought to daven Ma'ariv here. We ought to daven Mincha here. So we did. It was quite an experience. Now let's come back to London with some chief rabbis. David Teveler Schiff came from Hamburg. He was the rabbi of the Great Synagogue from 1765 to 1791. So he actually started in the first building of the synagogue, and he consecrated the 1791 building. And we know a lot about him because he wrote long letters to his brother, who was the rabbi in Copenhagen, in Yiddish or Judedeutsch. His niece came and became his housekeeper, and shortly afterwards his daughter-in-law. But there were certain things that he kept in his own control. One was the purchase of nightcaps from Hamburg. One was the purchase of handkerchiefs that had to be colored because he was addicted to snuff. And one was the purchase of lottery tickets. During his time, there was a row between him and a man called Meshulam Zalman, who was appointed by the other synagogues in London as to who shall be chief rabbi. In the end, it was settled by a row within the Portsmouth community, who accepted that Rabbi Schiff was the chief rabbi, and in token of submission to his rulings, they would send £5 of wax every year to the Great Synagogue which were to be used for the manufacture of candles to be burnt during the Day of Atonement. This was his cousin Isaac Polak, interesting, sardonic-looking man. He was very soft-hearted. He once guaranteed the debts of a member of the shul, which was a rash thing to do because the man defaulted on his debts. So Polak was seized and put into debtor's prison. This was sort of around the early summer, and the Rov was very upset. The wardens didn't particularly care. But then, of course, came September, which is Rosh Hashanah, peak time in the God business, and they needed their chazan, so they sprung him out of jail. One of his singers was this man, Meyer Lyon, who moonlighted as Michael Leone singing Italian opera for Mr. Handel. He was a very well-known tenor, and on one occasion, a man called Samuel Wesley, who was the brother of John Wesley, who founded the Methodist movement, came to hear Leone sing on Friday night in the shul. A lot of non-Jews did at the time, and Samuel Wesley liked what he had heard, so he wrote a hymn which is still in the book, the Hymns Ancient and Modern. The God of Abraham praise, who reigns enthroned above, ancient of everlasting days, and God of love. Jehovah great I am, by earth and heaven confessed. I bow and bless the sacred name, forever blessed. You gentlemen will undoubtedly recognize that tune. And if you look in Hymns Ancient and Modern, which is the Anglican hymn book, the tune is just described as Leone. It's playing silly. It does this from time to time, just to show who's macha. Oh, come on. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I've got a horrible feeling I'm going to have to come out of this and then go back in.
Okay, that's no problem.
Oh no, it's worked. It does this to me. Just, you know, I should have a bit of aggravation. This is called the Lokschenbuchel. The problem, of course, if people pledge money on a Shabbos, is you've got to remember how much they gave. So the Shammos of the Great Synagogue produced this book, which has the names of everybody in it, and he put that thread through the relevant hole. And here it is much closer up. These are the amounts. Shisha bis, which is sixpence, 6 old pence, 6d for those of us who can remember life before 1971. Aleph shilling, 12 pence, 1/20th of a pound. Chaybash, that's 18 pence, that's 1.5 shillings, 1 shilling and 6 pence. That's obviously a very popular donation because there's 2 columns for it. Now you come here for 2 columns. Chatzi keter means half a crown. That was 2 shillings and 6 pence, or 12.5p in modern money. And Aleph keter, 5 shillings, that's 1/4 of a pound, 25p. And the big guys gave chatzi guinea, half a guinea, that's 10 shillings and 6 pence. That was a lot of money in those days. And here, of course, are all their names written down the left-hand column. This is one of the characters who lived in London, the Baal Shem of London. He was an alchemist. He tried to make money out of changing base metal into gold. This is a genuine picture of him because it was done by a famous American artist called John Singleton Copley, whose name you'll see there. But because he's called the Baal Shem of London, you may find pictures purporting to be of the Baal Shem Tov, the man who founded the Hasidic movement, and they use this picture, but it's not that at all. He used to work all sorts of miracles. He once said to somebody, light this candle, go to Brighton, and I'll come to see you when the candle goes out. And the candle burned for about 3 weeks until he turned up. there were stories about him that are current in the East End of London, because I was told some of them by the non-Jewish groundsman of the United Synagogue Cemetery in Alderney Road, who was, I think, the third generation who'd looked after that cemetery, and he told me these stories. One of his clients was a man called Theodore, King of Corsica, and Theodore couldn't make up his mind whether to go with the French or the Italians, and the Baal Shem told him to go with the French, which is why Napoleon Bonaparte was a Frenchman and not an Italian. The Baal Shem owned 2 little Sifrei Torah. They are now in the Jewish Museum. Beautiful things. They're small, beautifully written in these hard silver cases. And this is a Shavuot Machzor that I have, 1796, by David Levi, who was a hat maker by trade, but a very, very learned man, and produced the first translations of the Machzorim and the Siddur and etc., etc. I actually found this in the New West End Synagogue, which had been opened in 1879. So whoever it belonged to, and he just left it in his seat, but he was still using this. It must have been almost 100 years old. And what's interesting is this list of subscribers, because most of them are from the East End, Lemon Street, Great Ailey Street, Stamford Hill, that was out in the country, Prescott Street. But then you've got here's Hart from Plymouth, and here's Lazarus Hart. He was the father of Lemon Hart, the rum man from Penzance in Cornwall. And over here, somebody else, of Mr. Joseph from Plymouth. And over here somewhere is Philip Levi's from Black River, Jamaica. So it had a big spread. This was the rabbi of the great synagogue, Solomon Herschel. He was the first of only 3 chief rabbis to have been born in England. He was born in London because his father was the rabbi of the great synagogue for 7 years, and that's when he was born. He was the rabbi of the shul for 40 years, didn't really speak English, but when he died a very wealthy man. We have some of his books on mathematics, which he has annotated, and he's reputed to have played the stock exchange very successfully. He was succeeded by this man, Nathan Marcus Adler, who was the first of the modern chief rabbis. He was a German. He'd been the chief rabbi of Hanover, where he had got on. Hanover, remember, was very closely allied with the British throne, and the Duke of Cambridge had been the elector of Hanover, and when the Duke's wife had been very, very ill, Rabbi Adler had organized congregational prayers, and she recovered, and the Duke sent him a large purse full of gold coins, which he sent back to the Duke and asked him please to distribute it among the poor of Hanover. So when it came to choosing a chief rabbi, they asked the Duke of Cambridge, and he was very much in favor. And he also knew a German student called Alberg of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, who became the prince consort, and the two remained friends. At that time, there was a man, though there had been a man in a linen draper called Levi Baron Cohen, who'd come to London. And when his first wife died, he married her sister. And between his 2 wives, he had 12 daughters and 7 or 8 sons, and he was known as the purveyor of wives to the young Jewish gentlemen of London. Among his sons-in-law was Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who had married Hannah Cohen, and Sir Moses Montefiore, who had married her sister Judith Cohen. So he was very well connected. Sir David Salomons was a Montefiore nephew. And he had tried to become the MP for Greenwich in 1851. The problem was that Jews couldn't become MPs because the oath included the words on the true faith of a Christian. So he tried to become an MP without taking that oath and couldn't. So he became the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London instead in 1855. In the meantime, the fight to become an MP was in the hands of Baron Lionel de Rothschild, who was really not only the head of the English family, English house, but to a great extent the head of the whole European organization. He was elected by the City of London on 5 occasions to be their MP, one of their MPs. It was a 4-member constituency in those days. And from 1843 until 1858, he had been unable to take his seat because of the oath. And every year the House of Commons had passed an act allowing the Jews to become MPs, and every year the House of Lords had rejected it. This is a Punch cartoon. You can see all the peers standing in terror on the benches while a stick insect marked Jew bill walks through between the seats. In the end, in 1858, matters came to a head because a sanitary engineer called, I kid you not, Thomas Crapper, had invented the water closet, which was depositing large amounts of you-know-what into the River Thames. And the summer of 1858 was a very dry summer, and the Thames hardly moved and had become very stagnant, and the stench was unbelievable, and their lordships and the wanted to go home. So in the end, the Earl of Lucan said, why don't we just let the lower house decide whatever, to settle their own form of oath, and for God's sake, let's go home. So that's exactly what happened. And on the 26th of July, 1858, Baron Lionel de Rothschild came to the House of Commons carrying with him the Hebrew Bible that he had been carrying for 11 years. And he approached the clerk of the house and he took the oath on the Hebrew Bible with his head covered and without the words "on the true faith of a Christian." And before he joined his colleagues on the front row of the government Liberal bench, his very close friend, this gentleman here, Benjamin Disraeli, the man who had been born as a Jew and had been converted by his father for all sorts of peculiar reasons, but who described himself as the blank page between the Old Testament and the New. Disraeli walked across the floor of the house and he and Rothschild shook hands. It was a very emotional movement for both of them. For England, it was a great moment for religious tolerance. In many ways, for the Jews, it was the end of the Middle Ages. This is Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler at the end of his life. You can see what being Chief Rabbi has done to him. He retired to Brighton, which he loved. He called it Dr. Brighton, and he lived in retirement for 11 years before his son became Chief Rabbi. In the meantime, I promised you some rogues, so this is the only rogue that you're going to get. This is a photograph of a stone that we had put down in one of the United Synagogue cemeteries. And why am I showing you this? Because Kosminski was at one stage the lead suspect to be Jack the Ripper, the murderer in the summer of 1888, I think it was. And indeed, Inspector Aberline, who had been in charge of the investigation, in his memoirs said that he always thought that Kosminski was the Ripper, but he'd gone mad and he was in a mental hospital until he died in 1919, and the United Synagogue buried him. Now let's come back to Chief Rabbis. This is the very Reverend Dr. Herman Marcus Adler, Hanoverian-born patrician English Jew, educated at University College School, where he was active in the Old Boys Network. He was referred to by Edward VII as my Chief Rabbi, and Edward VII gave him the CVO, a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. That was a very big honor. The problem, however, was that the insignia was a cross, and the Chief Rabbi couldn't be seen to go into shul on a Shabbos morning with a pectoral cross. So he came up with a real Anglo-Jewish compromise. He had a slit cut in his robes, and he put the bottom arm of the cross into the slit, so it wasn't a full cross, and he went into shul like that on Shabbos morning, and everybody was delighted. And he was succeeded by this man, Joseph Hermann Hertz. Hertz was born in Hungary but grew up in America. He had been the rabbi in Johannesburg, where President Kruger had expelled him for being too British, which did him no harm. Lord Curzon, who'd been in South Africa at the time, knew about this and was very much pro-Hertz. Hertz was a very strong Zionist, and he was one of the supporters of the Balfour Declaration. But at that stage, the Jews are coming into England across the North Sea. In about 1880, there were about 60,000 Jews in England. By 1914, there was something like 360,000 Jews. Most of them, I am quite convinced, were meant to be going to America. My own grandfather, who finished up in Gateshead and then in Liverpool, I am convinced was going to his siblings, all of whom had gone to Cincinnati. But 10% stayed there for various reasons. It was good, they had a job, they didn't feel like going on any further, it was comfortable. But if you look at pictures of our ancestors crossing the North Sea, they will always be on the top deck of the ship. Why? Because the cheapest way of crossing the North Sea was on a cattle boat. And on a cattle boat, the important passengers were the cattle. And the cattle decks had to be swabbed out from the droppings twice a day. And the planks didn't always fit, and the passenger accommodation was below the cattle decks. So it was very unpleasant down there. That's why, unless the weather was absolutely impossible, the passengers across the North Sea, which was could be a 4-day journey from the Baltic states, stayed on top. The atmosphere was much better. And when they came into the East End of London and other Jewish areas, but in the East End of London, they were attracted to the Jews' Free School in Bell Lane, whose job was to convert little Jews into little Englishmen, whereas, of course, the business of JFS in Kenton these days is to convert little Englishmen into little Jews. One of the attractions was that every child in the school received a present from the Rothschilds twice a year, at Pesach and at Rosh Hashanah. Every boy got a corduroy suit, and every girl got a dress, and every child got boots. And here you are. These kids have been in the school for some time because they've all got corduroy suits, and here are the boots reinforced with metal. And this was very important in the economy of the immigrant families, and indeed the school fed the kids as well during the day if they needed it, and in the evening their parents could come and learn English. And this is what they turned out. Wonderful comment. Every boy in my class has a clean collar. They have turned them out to be reasonably competent lower class Englishmen. When the war broke out, the Jews signed up in large numbers for the military, and there were the usual lies being told about the Jews haven't signed up and they're not in the army. So the chief rabbi went to visit general headquarters in 1915. Here is him in a car with the Reverend Michael Adler, who was the senior Jewish chaplain. He was the minister of the Central Synagogue in Great Portland Street. But look at the way that Hertz is dressed. He's a senior cleric, so he is wearing a shovel hat, which is what a bishop would wear. He's wearing bishop's robes. That was not chukas hagoy, as some people would say. It was a statement that Judaism was a socially acceptable religion. And Hertz supported very much the Zionist movement, and that led, obviously, on the 2nd of November 1917 to the Balfour Declaration. Dear Lord Rothschild, and it's addressed to the second Lord Rothschild, who was head of the English Zionist Federation, and this is really one of the most important letters ever, and it led pretty well directly to the British Mandate and pretty well directly to the State of Israel. But it was addressed to Lord Rothschild. This is Walter, the second Lord Rothschild. They wouldn't let him anywhere near the bank because he was absolutely useless at that sort of thing. But he liked animals, and he would drive around London in a coach and zebras, not horses. one of the people who was sent out to, one of the English Jews who went out to Palestine, mandate Palestine when it was granted, was Herbert Samuel, who was one of my heroes because I actually knew him. He was a member of the New West End. He was at my bar mitzvah. I've got a picture of, a present from him. And this is a picture that my kids gave me as a present. It's actually a photograph of him, but you'll see it's a Rosh Hashanah card. It was done by the Bezalel people in Jerusalem. And he was High Commissioner in England, in Israel from 1920 to 1925. And here are the 5 Jewish VCs of the Great War. Lieutenant Samuel Alexander de Pass was a Sephardi. He couldn't get a commission in the British Army, so he joined the Indian Army, and he was a lieutenant in the 34th Prince Albert Victor's Pune Horse. His uniform now belongs to the Jewish Museum. And his name, he got his VC posthumously in November 1914 in France. His name is on the Roll of Honor outside Bevis Marks. Keyser was an Australian who got his VC for taking the grenades that the Turks threw down to the Anzac trenches and hurling them back. G, who afterwards became an MP, was a tank man. And in the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, he was captured. He then killed his German captors, and later that afternoon went back and took a machine gun post, virtually single-handed, armed only with 2 revolvers. And here is Sergeant Izzy Smith, whose name was probably originally Shmulevich, who got his name, his VC, for bringing his wounded comrades in under very heavy German fire. And Private Jack White, I met somebody who actually knew him, who got his VC in Mesopotamia in March 1917 for pulling a raft on which there were some wounded soldiers across a river on a telephone wire under very heavy fire. And this is a picture that I put in only because David Druce is running the evening and the choir. When I did my first stint as the Minister of Belmont from 1969 to 1973, I consecrated a Sefer Torah with Jonathan Sachs, who had only been Chief Rabbi for a couple of months. And this picture was taken on that occasion, and I put it in because the choir master, as you will see, was David Druce on that occasion. We sang now, I remember a number of things, but particularly that we sang Naumburg's Se'u She'arim, and I was able to reach the top note at the end as well. And this, I'm going to finish off with one last picture, which has nothing to do with what I've been showing you, but it's a picture of a Chassid in Jerusalem who bought his children some beautiful costumes for Purim. You really need to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. I love this picture. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me.
Wow, Elkan, that was amazing. And a lot of stuff there which I've never seen before, so absolutely fascinating. One thing I need to show you before I open up the everybody to chat to you, can you see here, don't know whether you can see it, I'll just read you the header. It's Into the Light, the Medieval Hebrew Poetry of Mayor of Norwich.
Yes, I've got that. I've got that book myself. That's very, very interesting, especially the very, very long poem where he signs his name as I am Meir Ben Eliyahu.
Yeah, as an acrostic.
As an acrostic, Meir Norgitz from the city of Norwich, Asher Be'iyeh Hayam, which is Eretz Ha'i, which is in the island, de Mitkare Ingilterra.
Yes, absolutely.
Very, very interesting.
We were privileged to sing of some songs in Norwich when this book was published by the he's quite a famous journalist in the East Coast of England. His name is Kieran Pym. Yes. Kieran Pym. And we did a concert in Norwich the year before this was published. Kieran was in the audience and loved what we did. And then he spoke to me afterwards. He said, "I'm just about to publish this book, The Writers Guild of Norwich. Would you like, if I can arrange it, would you like to come to Norwich and be at the launch of the book?" So, to cut a long story short, we went there.
Wow.
One weekday evening after work, we all congregated at one of the London stations, and then we got the train up to Norwich. I think it was Liverpool Street. We got the train to Norwich, we did our turn, and then we caught the last train back to London. And we did some lovely stuff.
I was already in Israel when that was published. Otherwise, I would undoubtedly have been there.
Absolutely. All right, let me just unmute everybody. Okay, guys, you can unmute yourselves now. So I know the time is nearly 9:15, but I'm quite happy to continue for as long as you want, gentlemen. There's no time restriction as far as we're concerned, apart from Elkan is 2 hours ahead of us. So, Elkan, you need to just unmute yourself. Does anybody have any want to speak to Elkan? Nigel, yes.
Elkan, you mentioned Belmont Shore, but I remember that you, together with the late Shimon Harris, Oliver Sholem, and myself, formed the Belmont Shore Choir, which is still singing now after 50 years. In fact, last month it was the 50th anniversary of the Belmont Choir, and I've still been singing with it over the whole of the 50 years, with a couple of times when I was incapacitated and couldn't do the Yom Noraim, but otherwise it's been going ever since, and we now have up to 15 choristers singing regularly over the Yom Noraim and other Yom Tovim.
Pre-COVID.
Yeah, pre-COVID, of course.
Wow. Yeah, I remember that there was a group. I think there were 3 or 4 of you, and you stood around me.
Well, we stood at either side. Shimmer and I stood either side of you at the bimmer, and I never forget we used to wear a tartan tallis. We stood either side.
I had a tartan tallis sometimes for.
Yeah, you wore that, and then we used to rehearse at your house in Stanmore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the choir grew over the years after you left when David Freeman replaced you, and over the years we've grown and grown. We've actually had 49 choristers in our choir over the 50 years, and we've still got 15 now.
So you think you began in 70 or
71, 1971.
That's right. That's right. 71, Rosh Hashanah 1971.
Yeah, I joined the show early part of that year, and we came to you, the two of us, and we said we'd like to form a choir because Shimmer, bless him, he used to sing at the Christian Street Shul, a very unfortunate name for a shul, and he sang in the choir to Boy Chorister. And I was a boy chorister at Hendon Shul, pre-bar mitzvah, and that's how it started.
Wow. I know, he used to talk about Christian Street. That Christian had nothing to do with, it was named that after Queen Alexandra's father.
Right.
That's her, it wasn't sort of named after Christianity. He was Prince Christian of Denmark.
Yeah. Marvelous.
Mark?
I don't know where the years have gone.
Yes, hello. Yes, that about Christian Street is absolutely correct, because I went to Christian Street, Talmud Torah. And I'm very glad, Elkan, that you mentioned the Great Synagogue Duke's Place, because I was a boy chorister and soloist there for several years. And also sang over the years many times at Beavis Marks, just around the corner, so to speak. But what I wanted to mention particularly, I was interested to hear about your history of the Jews in medieval England. I mean, I live in Cambridge, and we've lived here for about 12 years from London after retiring as a fellow lawyer. I did much research on arriving here into the medieval Jewish community in Cambridge, which actually was their quarter was within a stone's throw of the our 1937 built Cambridge Orthodox Synagogue. What I was going to say was that my interest in medieval Cambridge Jewry led me to discover the location of the medieval synagogue and mikveh in the nearby town of Huntingdon. And that took me a few years, very much off and on research, which was sparked by one of my fellow congregants, Jonathan Janogly, Jewish, of course, and the MP for Huntingdon. You may have heard of him. And
he took over from the Prime Minister.
That's right. He absolutely did. And I met him for a chat in Huntingdon in 2011. He said, if we only knew the location of the medieval synagogue and here in Huntingdon, I would arrange for a plaque to be affixed to a nearby wall. Well, it took me a few years off and on research, both nationally and locally, and I actually found the location of the medieval synagogue and mikveh, and the actual plaque was unveiled by Jonathan Janogly and the then mayor of Huntingdon, with about 100 people present, followed by a fantastic reception at the Old Town Hall in Huntingdon. So, and indeed, the Cambridge community was exiled to Huntingdon in, I think it was 1275. The community there disappeared. The shul was destroyed virtually in 1285. And then, of course, as everyone knows, Jews were expelled from England in 1290. But it was great to actually, in this sense, be part of the history of medieval Jewry in Cambridgeshire, standing there as the Lee from Cambridge gave a speech about evidence to those who were present who weren't Jewish, and to actually see the plaque unveiled, a piece of history, if you like. I'm sorry to have gone on for so long.
No, that's actually very interesting, and it must have been very hard work.
Well, yes, it was, but very, very enjoyable. And I've written about it both factually and in my novels, my published novels, but factually. And the most recent article was for Jewish Renaissance, the quarterly magazine you may have heard of, Jewish Renaissance, and that was about 18 months, 2 years ago. So you could probably get a copy of that if you were interested, from Jewish Renaissance, or even read it online, possibly. No, it was absolutely fascinating and fantastic, and I discovered a lot of things about Cambridge that hadn't been known before, and indeed was very much involved in looking at kosher butchery in the old Jewish quarter of the medieval Jewish quarter of Cambridge. It's not much remains of kosher butchery practice in medieval times. But,
Mark, let's just see if anybody before we run out of time.
I'm sorry about
if anybody else wants to
carried away.
Does anybody else want to ask Elkan anything or flag anything? Anybody else want to mention anything? Ben, did you want to? No? Okay. All right. Yes. So I have to say, Elkan, thank you very, very much for giving up your Wednesday evening for us. Really appreciated.
It's
And
a pleasure.
a fascinating story, fascinating talk, I should say. And as you can see, some of your ex-parishioners are with us tonight, which is fantastic.
It's been wonderful. It's been a walk down memory lane for me.
Absolutely.
Nigel, Melvin, yourself, Julian, Charles. I mean, the Branstons. I mean, people who I knew very well in England, and it's lovely to see you all.
Yes, well, please God, after the risk of COVID lifts, we can come and visit you in Israel, which would be lovely.
I might be able to come to England as well.
Okay, well, if you do, please contact me and we'll meet up. It would be lovely.
I look forward to it. Gentlemen,
Okay.
now 22 minutes past 11. I'm going to bed.
Absolutely.
Right, quite right.
Well deserved, well earned.
Night, night.
Okay, everybody.
All the best.
Night, night.
Thanks
God
very
bless.
much, everybody,
well.
for a great
Chaim.
evening. And we'll see you all being well next week. Have a
David,
great week, everybody.
David, can you
Yeah.
send me the recording?
I will, of course.
Okay.
I will send it to you by something called WeTransfer.
Okay, I know.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
All
you
the best,
very much.
everybody.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Chaim.
Thank you.
Chaim. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers,
Be well.
everyone.
Be well.
Be well.